The first thing I should say is that we as an editorial board met with Governor Martinez, I want to say 5 or 6 months ago. And she told us at that time that if it were up to her, she would release the audit. What she told us is that it was Gary King's decision, that he is the one in charge of the investigation, and that a court has backed up that decision, now 2 courts. The interesting thing to me, and I just can't get over this, is that so this is in Gary King's hands. Once his investigation is done, there is no reason to keep that audit secret anymore. So he is also, as we know, one of 5 Democrats candidates potentially running against the governor. I'm not saying he's going to do this, but it is within his power to wait until a week before the election, 2 weeks before the election, whatever he thinks would be to his best advantage, and release the audit then. We're done with our investigation, here you go. That to me is just the politics of it. I just can't get beyond that. I'll talk just real briefly about the lawsuit, because that was really Heath and his group got that originated more than we did. He came to the Sun-News and asked us to participate in that. C.J. McElhaney, a local attorney, took that on for us because he was as concerned about open government as we are. The whole thing revolved around the law enforcement exemption. In the open records law, there's an exemption that says if there's an ongoing investigation, the law enforcement agency can keep that information private until the investigation is over. Our argument was that, well, I should say first that from the newspaper standpoint, the last thing we want to do is impair a law enforcement investigation. If there's $30-some million being stolen from fraud, we want those folks going to jail. We don't want to protect those people, but we do want the public to know what's going on. And so our argument was that the law enforcement investigation can go on absent this audit being held, that it would not hamper their investigation. Judge Driggers disagreed with us, and so that's where we find ourselves.
Well, I agree with what you're saying. I also feel, I guess on a personal level, and in talking with Gary King, at one point he said maybe I should not have taken the box of all of them. Maybe that I should have said, you send me X number of these people who you think are doing fraud, and trying to deal with those on in a lump time and not just one huge lump. And that certainly, I think, would have served the state better, but that's yesterday, and so we're in today. And I think the group in Alamogordo were released, and but where do you go when you're released? When your business is gone, you've lost your money, you're no longer in business, you're no longer capable of doing business because another agency has been brought in to run your business. I personally am getting, I don't know whether I'm getting more or whether this has brought more light to it, but I'm getting an awful lot of people saying I can't get the services we used to get are not there, we can't do this, people aren't getting paid for what they are doing. One agency that I'm working with closely said that they are owed $600,000, but they expect them to continue giving the services even though they're not being paid. So how many of us in this room could stay in business providing services if you weren't getting paid for your services? So I think that this has really been a nightmare, not only for the providers, but certainly for the people who consume the services. And after all, that's who we're trying to serve and make sure is right. So there is one, Alamogordo, and they were released, I guess saying that they are not fraudulent. And I'm sure that there are accounting mistakes. I think anyone who's been in business knows that you do your accounting and then you go back and you take it to your auditor and all of this to see what the kind of accounting mistakes are there. they're certainly not fraud. They're not intentional ways of trying to scam and get the Medicaid money. So Nicole is coming out from Carolina. She sued PCG back there and was very successful in a lawsuit. And she's coming, and I believe there's several other that I'm not at liberty to talk about right now, several other of the providers that are also going to be using her services. And it seems to me that this didn't have to go down this way. For one thing, when PCG came in, they went with the director of the Behavioral Health Collaborative and Optum Health, and they went to Arizona to interview providers in Arizona, and this was before the audit had ever even started. So why are you looking at providers to see if you have good providers to take over when you haven't even started an audit and are feeling that these kinds of things are going on? So I think that, in my personal opinion, I believe, and I do have a paper here from one of the attorneys from the HSD department, who basically had somewhat set out exactly what their program was going to be. And so I think, how are we going to be able to handle this and get it back to, we've put 15 New Mexico businesses out of business, and if they should be out of business, then I want them out of business. I think we all want them out of business if they're fraud and crooks and this sort of thing. But if they have made accounting mistakes or this sort of thing, then that is something that we should be looking at and trying to figure out how to help that be a better business as we would any other business in the state. So I'm hoping that we will be able to move forward and do that. I don't know whether these providers are going to be able to go back into business. I don't know how many of them have been able to hang on with an amount of money that would allow them, and particularly allow them, if they got paid back what they should be paid for the services they were required to provide, if they can stay in business for New Mexico. I'll just say this because to me it's very important. I have a grandson that's schizophrenic and bipolar. He's in California because you don't have this up and down and all switch, carve in, carve out, do this, do that. And every time we have a new administration, I'm not saying this administration or what administration, but every new administration that comes in decides that they will play with behavioral health. And so we find our people, our family, our loved ones who have mental health problems are in a constant flux of what's happening within the system that they're supposed to be able to operate in. And so I think hopefully at some point, maybe after this scandal that has been out there, that maybe we will finally figure out it's time that we tried to figure out exactly what is the right way to handle people with mental health problems. Having them in the hospital is far more expensive than providing the services for them. Thank you.
One of the most interesting things for me when the story broke, we were talking about 15 agencies that provided services to 30,000 New Mexicans who represented 80% of all clients of Medicaid-funded behavioral health services in the state. This was huge. And as a journalist, I don't think I've ever covered a story that came so swiftly with nobody knowing it was coming and that impacted so many people in such a tangible way. We're talking about people who get suicide counseling, drug and alcohol treatment, who are suffering from depression. Senator Papen talked about governors playing with behavioral health services. These are people, I don't want to overgeneralize, but many of these people are some of the most fragile people in our society, who don't vote, who don't write letters to the editor, who can't stand up for themselves when something goes wrong. And so So we looked at it and said, somebody needs to look at what's happening to them. The initial media coverage was about the potential harm to taxpayers, and we asked the question, what about clients? And with the Sun-News, and there were a few other news organizations in the state, the Taos News did a great job of trying to document disruptions in services, and I think we documented more in Las Cruces than anywhere else because we were working on it here pretty actively. But it became clear that this transition, the governor promised there would be no disruptions. There were. It was chaotic. Just today we have a report out that the federal agency that oversees Medicaid was here investigating in December, and they said there was a 23% drop in the number of patients or clients that 10 of these 15 agencies were serving. So we wanted the audit. We need to tell people as journalists why government takes an action like this so that people can decide for themselves if it was justified or not. No, you can't have the audit. So we start requesting other documents like emails that might indicate what their conversations were. No, you can't have those. So we start asking questions and not getting responses. So we file records requests for what's some creative way to ask for a document that might indicate something. Eventually, the Human Services Department was complaining on Twitter that we had so overburdened them with records requests that we were getting in the way of them doing their job of making sure there were no disruptions in services while we were documenting disruptions. And so that's sort of how we got to the lawsuit. The governor made kind of a snarky comment in an editorial board meeting at the Sun-News about if people didn't understand this because we weren't doing our job. And Walt wrote about it, and my boss at NMID wrote about it, and we just kind of went from there. And for us, this is not about standing up for the providers or believing that they were screwed. We don't know if they committed fraud or not. It's about believing that there were disruptions, that this was handled in a way that was chaotic. We established in our reporting that they didn't have to do it this way. They didn't have to freeze payments. They made that choice. So we just want people to be able to know what the allegations are. It's an election year. The governor's up for re-election. The Attorney General is running for governor. People should be able to evaluate their actions and say, I do think that was justified or not. I don't think you can say right now that people who have a really strong opinion on that really know if that's an intelligent decision or not, if their opinion is right, because we don't have the information publicly to make that decision.
Brian Furrow, who is a reporter for Heath's group, has some previous knowledge working in the Medicaid, Medicare field. When this first happened, the governor's office told us we had no choice. If we don't freeze these payments immediately, we risk losing all of our Medicaid money. And, well, you know, if that's true, absolutely. I mean, you can't risk hundreds of millions of dollars in order to you just can't risk that much money. I mean, that would have been catastrophic. They couldn't have recovered from that if that was true. Brian Furrow, who knew a little bit more about this than I did and others, knew that that wasn't true. And so I think that there were other alternatives that for whatever reason, the Human Services Department didn't pursue. But I do think that what we were told initially by the governor's, and what the governor's office still says today, is not accurate.
It was a matter for Brian to reading the regulations, which were changed by the Affordable Care Act, and there was sort of this nebulous language put in. I think it was one of the deals to get maybe conservative Democrats in Congress to vote for the Affordable Care Act, that they could also say they were changing the law to make it tougher on Medicaid fraud. I think it was changed from a shall to a may, as in freezing payments. Instead of you may do it, you shall do it. But then they added a bunch of exemptions so that the regulation essentially gives you the same flexibility. the administration continues to ignore the exemptions or say they don't apply. We read them. We called the federal agency. They said, "Oh yeah, they could have found an exemption." And we talked to other experts, and I think it was pretty basic reporting. It's what a journalist should do, right? It's just ask the questions and find it. It just took somebody focusing on that and doing it.
Yeah.
And Walt is right. They continue to say to this day, they just ignore what's out there. No, we had no choice. No, we had no choice. Okay. So we just keep pointing out, yes, you did.
Senator, do you know, were there any other options even considered?
I don't think they were, and I have a here, which I'll be happy to share with you, a thing that was done by Mr. Larry Hayek in 12, and it really sort of lays out their plan of how they're going to do this that we came across. So some of this, I need to be closer, I'm sorry, and so it's sort of a plan that tells you how to go about doing this. I guess my consternation is why? What was the reasoning for this? I really don't understand what it was. The Arizona companies are now asking for a higher rate of compensation, and they're already being compensated at a higher rate than what our providers were being compensated for, and they were in business, And so is this, I really am sort of I guess I'm not in the dark because I think I know what's going on, but I don't understand why we would take a very fragile population and set this kind of a deal up that in the long haul hurts them, puts our New Mexico businesses out of business, and brings in people from Arizona. Are they going to stay if they leave tomorrow? What happens to our system? Can the people who were there and that we hope we're not doing a fraud, do they have the wherewithal to start their businesses back up again and to provide these services? What about our military and the people with the things that they have when they come home? I sure would have it. I know if I was over in Iraq and some of these places, I would for sure need some mental health services, and so would my family. And so I guess I don't understand what the game plan was and what the benefits they felt that they were going to get from this. I think is your lawsuit, the newspaper's lawsuits go on, and I think with Nicole Emanuel coming and bringing suit of several of the providers, we may get more to the bottom. But Optum Health was being paid $40+ million, and they were supposed to be the oversight of the providers. And so if you're being paid that kind of money and you're supposed to be overseeing the providers and coming in and looking, going into their offices and what have you, and saying, this, you're filing this wrong, this is wrong, or they're getting in there and they come in and say, you need to change the way you're filing. And I must say that Optum Health themselves changed the way that you were supposed to file several different times. And then they put in a new computer. Well, we all know what that is when you get into a new computer in a system. I don't care whether it's in the public schools or whether it's in the car business or whether it's at the newspaper or whatever. Everybody's scrambling to try and get to see how that new system will work. Optum Health, on many of these providers, had given them 85s, 92s, 95s, 98s when they had come in and audited them. And so if they had come in and been doing their job for their millions of dollars and auditing these companies, and then all of a sudden you have this paper that's written in 12 that talks about how to go in and do this stuff, I fail to understand that. It's a jigsaw puzzle that somehow or another the pieces don't fit. The pieces just don't fit. And I still am concerned about why? What was this about? Why are we doing this to people, to providers that provide the services to the people who need these kinds of services desperately? There's a gentleman with a hand up back there, but so I'm sort of nonplussed. And let me just finish one other thing. And Optum Health themselves have been fined several years ago $1 million for the way they do business. So, it is a mess, but in every administration that we have, we're carved in, we're carved out, we're put with a regional, we're put here, we're put here. I don't know how you ever run a system and keep a system with any kind of consistency when every 4 years you throw the baby out with the bathwater and you start all over again. It gets to be very, very difficult to try and do those things.
It certainly wasn't called for by the agencies that got run out of business, so from them I'm sure it was hostile. That's the whole point, is we can't see the audit, and so maybe this was completely baseless. Maybe it was better grounded than we know. That's where I'm coming from on that.
Let me take a stab at answering your question, though, which was, what could they have done differently? And let me make clear, I'm not saying they should have done this. I'm a journalist, but it's been suggested to me that had they chosen not to freeze Medicaid payments immediately, they still could have referred the cases to the Attorney General for investigation, to the State Tax and Revenue Department, to the FBI, to the U.S. Attorney. All those agencies are investigating, so as not to leave people without services, and notify these agencies, whatever, you're under investigation, have the records taken by law enforcement agencies or whatever needed to happen, but continue providing services. Because the way it happened, in effect, I'll talk about Southwest Counseling Center in Las Cruces to La Frontera. The CEOs of those two companies, who were the first employees to talked to each other for the first time 5 days before legally the changeover happened. And so they had 5 days to plan, I think, thousands of clients, multi-million-dollar budget, how we're going to hand it all over, how we're going to transition employees from one agency to the other, what are we going to do where people walk away and leave. That's why things fell through the cracks. There wasn't time in planning.
Well, and then there was the issue with the prescription drugs for the first week or so.
There were issues with the new agency that came in didn't know they had to apply for a pharmaceutical license.
Right.
So they had to shut down their pharmacy, and it was only half a day because the administration said, oops, well, we'll issue you an emergency one, but it's still closed for half a day. There was a vehicle dispute between the old and the new agency on, the new agency hadn't paid for the vehicles yet, but was using them, and, well, you haven't paid us, so we're going to take them back, and just things like that. There was one agency in northern New Mexico during the freeze that went from 100 BMS workers who are people who go around with kids during the day who have behavioral issues, and they had to cut back from 100 to 30. And so could they have issued an exemption? We're not going to freeze your funding while you're under investigation. Let the investigations play out. They were already, as Senator Papen pointed out, they were already talking to these Arizona companies, have them ready to come in if or when charges are filed in a certain agency. Maybe that would have worked better. I don't know. And again, we don't know. Maybe it was justified to move this quickly. We just don't know.
You know, I think if there is questionable business practices going on, I think with the dollar amount that we were paying Optum Health to do the kind of work, to be the overseer, the broad overseer of all of this, I think in many ways there are ways that they could have come in. They could have come in and said to this particular provider, we feel that you are overbilling on number 6721 too many times, or whatever it is for this patient, or whatever it is they thought they were finding. And then bring in a business manager. I liken it to my husband was in the banking business, and when they would bring in a federal auditor into the bank came in. They didn't shut the bank down. People still could cash their checks and deposit their checks and do all of that. But the banking auditor was there to go through everything, to go through their books and to tell them every place that they felt that they had something wrong that they were doing or something they needed to correct or this sort of thing. It seems to me that we could have done this in a much more, I guess, professional manner, and that they could have been able to bring business-type managers in or auditors in to the business to sit down with their financial people and be looking at it and picking up the fraud, certainly picking up where they were sloppy or where they didn't do it right or where they were putting in the wrong numbers or what. But I have to say this, that Optum Health also changed the way that they wanted the billings presented to them. I want to say 5 different times. I may be wrong on the number. It may have been 4, may have been 6. But they changed the way that they wanted the companies to file their requests. And so if you had, for instance, they called it double billing. If I went in and saw Dr. Haussamen for my regular visit, and so that was that day, and it was filed in. And so then I go over and I see the other doctor, but this is because I have an entirely different issue that isn't his expertise. I do this. Why should I have to go to, say, back home to Deming and come back the next day to see Dr. Rubel for that issue when I could have seen him on the same day, but for 2 different types of problems? You know, one is a foot problem, one is a kidney problem, let's say, as far as your brain is concerned. So there was a lot of this, and I think there were a lot of things that could have been cleared up with business management or auditor type people coming into these agencies without taking an auditing agency to Arizona before they had ever begun their audit, before they had ever even begun their audit.
I'll just say real briefly, the answer that Gary King gave to us is that they didn't want to provide them with that information because they believed that that would help them build their defense. And so that's why they wanted it. I'm not saying that I'm saying that's what Gary King said.
It was ultimately her decision, I believe, to issue a finding of credible allegations of fraud against each of these agencies and refer it to the Attorney General in a technical sense, not the governors, it was the Secretary. As to why she did it, you know, one of the things we filed an Inspection of Public Records Act request for was her email, which we still don't have. I mean, I would say that we have filed a lawsuit in what we believe is one violation of the Act, but we've experienced dozens. And that's one of them. We'd like to see her email. What was she talking about in relation to this? What were her conversations leading up to these actions that they took? And we don't have any idea.
The only thing I would add is I think it's safe to say that she wouldn't have taken this action without consulting the governor and without, you know, the governor fully knowing and signing off on it.
Right.
Well, you know, we also have another audit from Hector Balderas, our state auditor, who doesn't find quite the same kind of results that HSD has come up with. And of course, we don't have the decision from Gary King yet. the Attorney General. But with Hector Balderas' audit, and I don't know whether there's anybody that can make any copies of this for you, but I'm happy to leave this and have copies, have the access to these copies. But he's not seeing there, and I think the due process piece is so troubling to the providers, because it's like someone knocking on your door and saying, we're arresting you for fraud and or whatever, or rape or whatever, and you don't know what they're talking about, and yet you're hauled off to jail, so to speak, which is what basically these providers have been done. They've been shut down. So we're shutting you down. We're shutting your body shop down because we assume this. But you can't be told what the problem is. And are you doing it or are you not doing it? And do you have your sort of day in court to be able to prove that, as I say, this is not Napoleonic law in this country. It's a very different law. That you're not able to prove and to show, well, this is what this is, and this is where this is, and showing maybe you are doing some fraudulent things, knowingly or unknowingly. But at least nobody at this point, I think it's sort of like the people sitting with the Malaysian airline. They're just sitting there. Did the plane go down? What happened to the plane? And I think the provider's in the same absolute position of what? Well, is there any possibility? Can we hang on to enough money to maybe even get a miniature start back on our business? What happens if Arizona leaves tomorrow? They want more money. If they don't get it and they leave, then where are we? And it's not where are we, and I do have a great deal of empathy for the businesses, but where are we with our people who need these services provided to them? It costs a lot more to put a person into the hospital for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks to get them back on track than it does to provide the services for them. So you end up in that sort of thing, but I think at the present time the administration is able to say, we can't do anything. We handed it over to the Attorney General. And so, as he told me, he said I should not have taken the whole box. I should have taken a piece at a time and done some of that. But that's water under the dam. That won't happen. But I think we tried to meet with CMS. A lot of legislators, the Speaker, myself, several other legislators, when we were in Atlanta, and trying to deal with CMS sometimes is an extremely difficult process.
Not only has she been resistant to requests from Heath and from us and from media throughout the state, but she's also been resistant to requests from the legislature. During an interim meeting on this topic before the legislative session, she was asked some difficult questions about it, and instead of asking those questions, she got up and walked out of the meeting.
She also said that she would not, and he hadn't even asked any questions. She said, I will not take any questions from Senator McSorley. He hadn't, at this point, opened his mouth, and I think Representative Easley, and he can be tough. He can ask tough questions, but you know what? That's what he's there for, and that's what she's there for. And I guess Secretary Easley, who is now deceased, but was a very good member of that committee, was really drilling, and she just sort of said, right back at you. And then she said, I'm out of here, and got up and left. And so, you know, you're dealing with somebody that it's very difficult to deal with, or to try and build a one-on-one dialogue with them, to try and see if you can't sit down and figure some stuff out, because we also invited her to a meeting in Roswell, the Behavioral Health Subcommittee. She said, I'm not driving 200 miles. We drove 200 miles, you know, and so it's become a very combative, very atmosphere between
the legislature and the secretary. I have to say that Brent Ernst is a delight to deal with. He will answer the questions, and he is there, and he's when he can. But he at least is responsive to us, and we don't get blown off.
Let me add too, on the due process question that you both have talked about. The Attorney General has completed its investigation into one of the 15, the counseling center in Alamogordo. So they released that portion of the audit. We have that. It is common, for example, government agencies in New Mexico, when they're audited, have an opportunity to respond before the audit is completed or released publicly. And that was not done in this case. The AG went and talked to people at the counseling center while they were investigating and looked through documents that PCG apparently didn't look at, and were able to answer some of the questions and eliminate some of the findings that were in the PCG audit. And so they still found problems, but a smaller number of them. And the way the PCG audit works, they sample tested, I don't know, a few dozen perhaps, bills, receipts, and then they extrapolate out to the whole and estimated, a massive number of overbilling or fraud. The Attorney General's was a much smaller number to start from, and so had PCG had the same findings the AG did, their estimation in this case of the counseling center of how much overbilling there was would have been much smaller. So where our lawsuit stands, the judge ruled that the audit could stay secret for now in November. It wasn't a total loss for us. The AG's office in the meantime, and let me just say that the AG charges us with holding public officials accountable, and that includes him. We did get partial recovery of attorney's fees because the Attorney General released a portion of the audit in the middle of our lawsuit in response to our lawsuit, which we argued was an admission that they had inappropriately withheld it. But more importantly, the judge, for the first time in the state's history, set in place what's at least an informal process for judicial review, so an independent branch of government reviewing decisions to cite the law enforcement exemption. Because it had become really common in New Mexico for anybody from local government to state government just saying, oh, it's a police matter. The fear is the governor, any governor, not necessarily this one, could say, I don't want them getting those records that would make me look bad, so I'm going to send them to my own state police.
That's right.
And then call it a law enforcement issue. Our judge, in our case, Judge Driggers, was given a copy of the audit by the Human Services Department. He read the whole thing, the unredacted, several hundred-page version, the portions they had released that were redacted. He read those. He compared all of it, and he decided that for the time it could remain secret. But part of our argument from our attorney was this investigation cannot drag on forever. You can't keep the secret forever. So he said we could come back in 6 months, which will be in May, and ask again, okay, we still don't have it, or in this case, we don't have any of it but the Alamogordo Counseling Center. Now we want you to give us a different ruling. So we haven't discussed whether we're going to do that. I think we were waiting to see what would happen in the months in between. It doesn't appear that things are moving at a pace that we'll have the whole audit by May, but maybe we will. I mean, Walt raised the possibility that we'll get up to the election and hey, look how transparent I am, I'm releasing the whole thing. I don't know, but I think us going back and asking him to reverse his decision and order the audit released is a possibility.
Yeah, I do too. And I just want to say something real quick about the law enforcement exemption to the Open Records Act, because Heath is exactly right. Anybody in a position of authority can open an investigation and shield records that would be embarrassing to them. Where this has always bothered me the most is in cases of police-involved shootings. And I'm not knocking the police. They've got a tough job. I wouldn't want to do it. I couldn't do it. But anytime there's a police-involved shooting, they have a task force that's made up of members from the LCPD, the Sheriff's Office, the State Police, and the NMSU police force. They get together, they put together a report, they send that report to the district attorney, and the district attorney then says, we're going to go forward with charges or we're going to find this a justifiable shooting. As long as she finds it a justifiable shooting, that report then becomes sealed under the law enforcement exemption to the Open Records Act, and nobody ever gets to see it. Now, there was a case recently that went to court, the Lance Hummel case, where because it went to court, all of this information did come out, and even though the people bringing suit lost their case and the jury found that the shooting was justified, there was information that came out in trial that showed that conflicted with what was in that original report, so that we know that some of the information in that original report was wrong. But that was what the district attorney relied on to make her decision, or his decision. And the last thing I want to say about this is when Susana Martinez was the district attorney and Chuck Franco was the undersheriff, you had shootings involving sheriff's officers where the final decision was being made by the wife of the undersheriff, and it just drove me nuts.
Well, let me add to that too. This is an excellent point about these officer-involved shootings, and I would say we've now had, I think, 3 district attorneys in a row in Doña Ana County who keep those secret. I think that's a violation of the law. Those reports are released in Albuquerque, and they've had a number of officer-involved shootings up there, and the media gets them and writes about them. And back when I was doing my political blog, I wrote a column where I said, trust us, where the government is never less justified than when you take somebody's life, when the government takes someone's life. I think that is a really important issue.
But just finally, in terms of where the health situation goes, I think that depends on Senator Papen and the legislature and the governor. Because Senator Papen honestly has been a leader in the legislature on this issue ever since I've been here. And so, Senator, where do we go from here?
Yeah. Well, Roger Magdalena and I also proposed a bill this last year that would have provided more sunshine into credible allegations of fraud and the way this would go, and it did not get a message, and it was not germane. And I do chair that committee, but I couldn't try and make a bill of mine germane that other people's bills weren't being germane and trying to scoot something through, and I probably couldn't have done it anyway. But we're going to be carrying that again next year, and so it's trying to be sure that we have the sunshine on the credible allegations of fraud, and that to try and prevent the abuses that are going on, because I think there are very definite abuses, and that people do need to know what is happening, and that requiring HSD to use public procurement when they're doing what they're doing, and trying to work with the agencies, because I don't care whether Arizona stays here, I do care, or whether we have our local people. But what I don't care about is I think that eventually Arizona's probably, they're going to, for one reason or another, get into some sort of a problem with Arizona, and it may be over the fact that we're not willing to keep raising what we're paying the people from Arizona. So they may decide that they're going to leave, and so then where are we? So we need to make sure, and so next year we're going to be carrying this same bill or a similar bill with probably even more teeth in it. It probably, if this governor is still the governor, it probably will be vetoed, but at least our message will be out there, and maybe we can get her to not veto it. But we feel very, very strongly in the legislature that this way that this has been done has not been done right, has not been done fair, and it is done behind closed doors.
That's a very good question. One of my immediate questions was, if this is going to happen, there are agencies, there's a very large agency in northern New Mexico that maybe could fill some of the void there. Why not a community like El Paso and Las Cruces, where there are ties and it would be easier to move in, maybe Amarillo and the eastern side of the state. I don't know what, but I could tell you what the CEO of La Frontera, which is one of the 5 Arizona companies, told me. And this addresses a little bit, too, the question, I think, of why was the Human Services Department talking with these Arizona companies before the PCG thing began. I don't know what to
That's
call
going to
it.
be tough for us.
Yeah. There was an Optum. The Human Services Department calls it an audit. I don't know enough about it, but the Optum computer system supposedly raised some red flags, which led to the Human Services Department contracting with PCG. But the way the La Frontera CEO talks about it, it was Optum that went to them, not the Human Services Department. Said, we may have some major problems in New Mexico, and Optum also operates in Arizona. You're close by. We know you guys. If we have a problem, can you come in? And it suggested that maybe at the start this was driven more by Optum Health than it was the Human Services Department. I don't know. That's just what he told me, but that's what I can add to the discussion.
You know, in terms of La Frontera, I don't know either. We did ask the governor that question, and what she told us was that they were, a large corporation, had a good track record, and that they were right next door, and they were ready to move in on a moment's notice. So that was the explanation we got from the governor's office.